Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Today we'll delve into the dark depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where in the mid-19th century, two distant cousins wove a web of secrets so dark that even local historians hesitate to fully document it. Tell us where you're watching from, because this story will take you to a place where the mountains hold silences that last for generations. It's the year 1857 in the mountainous regions of eastern Kentucky, where communities lived isolated by steep canyons and dense forests that seemed to swallow the sunlight. Back then, the Appalachian Mountains were a world unto themselves, where families had known each other for generations and outsiders were greeted with silent distrust. The roads were muddy trails that wound between giant pines, and the county law rarely reached those misty heights. Silas Brennan was 20 years old when rumors first began to circulate through the isolated settlements of the region. Tall, thin as a dry oak branch, with dark eyes that seemed never to fully blink, he lived in a dilapidated wooden cabin on the slopes of Mount Black Ridge. His father had disappeared years before under mysterious circumstances, and his mother was rarely seen at the local markets. Silas worked sporadically as a trapper, selling furs in the nearest villages, always arriving at dusk and leaving before dawn. Ruth Calloway was her third cousin, also 20, born and raised on an abandoned farm about 10 miles away. Her parents had died of typhoid fever when she was 17, leaving her alone on a property that resembled a graveyard of broken dreams. Her nearest neighbors, the Hutchins family, lived nearly 5 miles down the mountain. Ruth had coal dark hair and a pallor that locals attributed to the solitude of the mountains. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice came out as a drawn-out whisper that made people instinctively shy away. No one knows for sure when Silas and Ruth began seeing each other regularly. Perry County records are sparse from that time, but we know from letters preserved in the Hazard Historical Archives that in the winter of 1856, traveling merchants began avoiding certain routes that passed near the two cousins' properties. A draper named Nathaniel Woods wrote to the county sheriff, reporting that he had lost 3 fellow traders on those trails in less than 4 months. The Appalachian Mountains of that era were known for their natural dangers. Black bears roamed freely. Canyons hidden by morning fog could swallow a man and his horse without warning, and the biting winter cold turned trails into icy death traps. But there was something different about these disappearances. Horses were found days later, still saddled, wandering the forests without their owners. Suitcases and goods remained intact, money untouched. It was as if the travelers had simply vanished into the thin mountain air. Sheriff Jacob Thornhill, a 52-year-old who ruled the county with a firm but fair hand, initially attributed the disappearances to the region's known dangers. In those days, losing travelers in the mountains was not uncommon. Grieving families would receive condolences, bodies would be searched for a few days, and then life would move on with its slow, relentless pace. But Thornhill was meticulous with his records, and in the early spring of 1857, he noticed a disturbing pattern. All the disappearances occurred within a roughly 20-mile radius, centered between Silas and Ruth's properties. All involved men traveling alone. All occurred between dusk and dawn, and in every case, the travelers were reported to have mentioned plans to seek shelter or purchase provisions in the area's isolated cabins. The sheriff began making discreet inquiries, but the mountains guard their secrets with iron loyalty. In March of that year, an itinerant preacher named Reverend Samuel Mackey stopped at Hazard's Tavern before heading to the higher settlements. He was known for his genuine kindness and for never refusing hospitality, even in the most wretched cabins. Mackey mentioned to the tavern keeper that he intended to preach in the isolated farmlands of Black Ridge Mountain and that he hoped to return within a week. When 2 weeks passed without news, his congregation in Lexington sent urgent letters to Sheriff Thornhill. The search for Reverend Mackey mobilized nearly 40 men from neighboring communities. For 5 days, they scoured trails, investigated caves, and covered every inch of known routes. On the 6th day, they found his horse tethered near a crystal-clear stream, just 2 miles from Silas Brennan's cabin. The Reverend's Bible was carefully placed on the saddle, its pages marked with dried wildflowers, but of the man, there was no trace. That's when the whispers began to take shape. We now know, through preserved diaries of residents of the time, that many already suspected something sinister. But in the 19th century Appalachian Mountains, accusing someone without proof was dangerous. Families protected their own, and justice was often resolved outside the courts. Sheriff Thornhill knew he needed more than intuition and coincidence. He needed concrete evidence, and he was willing to climb those misty mountains as many times as necessary. The spring of 1857 brought heavy rains that turned the trails into rivers of mud, but it also brought something unexpected, something that would begin to unravel the dark veil that covered those mountains like a silent shroud. The April rains of that year were particularly violent, collapsing entire hillsides and exposing layers of earth that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. It was during one of these storms that a farmer named Thomas Eldridge, who lived about 8 miles south of Ruth's property, made a discovery that would change the course of the investigation. While surveying the flood damage on his land, he noticed something glistening on the bank of a stream that had burst its banks. It was a silver pocket watch, engraved with initials Thomas recognized immediately. It belonged to Michael Dougherty, a hardware dealer who had disappeared the previous fall while traveling in the mountains. The watch was partially buried in the mud, its chain still intact, as if it had been carefully placed there and then covered with earth. Thomas wrapped the object in a cloth and rode for hours in the pouring rain until he reached the sheriff's office in Hazard. Sheriff Thornhill examined the clock by the dim light of an oil lamp. Rain hammered on the wooden roof of the office as he turned the object between his fingers, observing every detail. The clock still worked perfectly, its delicate gears untouched by moisture. This was impossible if it had been exposed to the elements for 6 months. Someone had stored the clock in a dry, protected place before burying it recently. But why? And where were the other belongings of the missing? Thornhill called a discreet meeting with the county's most trusted men. Among them was Jonathan Price, an experienced tracker who knew every trail in the Appalachian Mountains like the lines on his own hand. Price was 43 years old and had served as a scout during conflicts with Native American tribes decades earlier. If anyone could find clues in those treacherous mountains, it was he. The next morning, as soon as the storm subsided, Price began his search for the spot where the watch had been found. He worked methodically, examining the flood-disturbed earth, following the course of the stream up the mountain. After 3 hours of walking through dense vegetation and slippery rocks, he reached an area where the terrain rose steeply. There, partially hidden by rhododendron bushes, was a narrow crevice in the rock, barely visible to the untrained eye. Price lit a torch and squeezed through the opening. The crevice widened a few meters ahead, forming a small natural cave with a low ceiling and damp, moss-covered walls. The air inside was heavy with an earthy odor, mixed with something more disturbing that he couldn't quite identify. At the back of the cave, stacked in a macabre order, were objects that made Price's blood run cold. There were leather suitcases in varying states of decay, their locks rusted but still intact. Clothes were folded and stacked with unnatural care. Bibles, wallets, pocket knives, coin purses. Every item appeared to have been cleaned and organized before being stored there. Price counted the belongings of at least 8 different people. Among them, he recognized the medical bag of a doctor who had disappeared 2 years earlier while responding to calls on remote farms. The tracker didn't touch anything. He marked the path to the cave and returned immediately to Hazard, riding with an urgency that made his horse foam. When he reported his discovery to Sheriff Thornhill, they both understood the gravity of what they were facing. These were no natural accidents, no ordinary raids by mountain bandits. There was something much darker going on in those isolated heights, something planned and executed with calculated coldness. Thornhill organized a group of 12 armed men and returned to the cave with Price the next morning. They documented every item they found, creating detailed lists that still exist in the Perry County archives. Dr. Elias Whitmore, the county physician, accompanied the expedition and examined the objects with clinical attention. He noticed something disturbing on the clothing. Small, dark stains that had resisted time and moisture. Stains he recognized but preferred not to speculate about aloud at the time. The discovery raised terrible questions. Where were the bodies? Why had the belongings been stored so carefully? And most importantly, who was responsible for this macabre collection? The cave was practically equidistant from Silas and Ruth's property, but that wasn't enough evidence to bring formal charges. Thornhill knew he needed more, much more. He decided to adopt a different strategy. Instead of confronting his cousins directly, he began observing them from afar, gathering information from nearby residents. The Hutchins family, Ruth's distant neighbors, revealed disturbing details. They had noticed smoke rising from the abandoned farmhouse's chimney at odd hours, always during the early hours of the morning, and on several occasions They saw two figures walking together along the trails in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying what appeared to be heavy burdens. A woodcutter named Isaac Drummond provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. He had camped one night near Silas's cabin, hidden among the trees while hunting deer. Around 2 in the morning, he saw Silas emerge from his home carrying a covered lantern that emitted only a sliver of light. The young man walked through the forest with the certainty of someone who knows every root and every stone, even in absolute darkness. Drummond followed him out of curiosity and watched as Silas met Ruth in a clearing halfway between their properties. The two spoke for a few minutes in tones so low that words were indistinguishable, and then they continued up the trail together, toward the more remote areas of the mountains. Sheriff Thornhill spent weeks collecting these fragmented accounts, piecing together a mosaic of circumstantial evidence. But he knew that in 1857, in a Kentucky courtroom, he would need much more than testimonies of nocturnal encounters and chimney smoke. He needed to catch Silas and Ruth in some concrete act, or find irrefutable evidence connecting them to the disappearances. The opportunity arose unexpectedly in mid-May. A Louisville merchant named Herbert Langston arrived in Hazard with a variety of goods, planning to sell his wares on the isolated mountain farms. Langston was a robust 35-year-old man, experienced in solo travel, and known for his ability to handle difficult situations. When he mentioned his intention to climb Mount Black Ridge, Sheriff Thornhill saw a risky but necessary opportunity. Thornhill proposed a bold plan to Herbert Langston. The merchant would agree to follow his planned route through the mountains, but would be discreetly followed by a group of armed men keeping a safe distance. If Silas or Ruth approached Langston with suspicious intentions, the sheriff's men would be close enough to intervene. It was dangerous, but Langston was brave and understood that his cooperation could save future lives. He accepted without hesitation. On the morning of May 23, 1857, Langston set out from Hazard with his wagon loaded with tools, cloth, and supplies. The sky was covered in low clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Thornhill and 6 hand-picked men, including tracker Jonathan Price, followed at a distance of approximately half a mile, keeping hidden among the dense trees that lined the main trail. Langston stopped at 3 farms throughout the day, selling goods and chatting with the locals as he normally would. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the mountain peaks, he reached the fork in the trail that led to both Silas's cabin and Ruth's farm. That's when it all began to happen. A figure emerged from the forest with the stillness of a shadow. It was Ruth Calloway, wearing a worn dark dress and a shawl that partially covered her pale face. She approached the wagon with measured steps, her voice low and almost musical as she greeted Langston. She said she lived alone up the mountain and needed supplies, asking if he would be willing to climb to her property before darkness fell completely. Langston, following the sheriff's instructions, politely agreed. Ruth walked ahead of the wagon, guiding the trader along a side trail that wound between towering pines. Less than a mile away, hidden among rocks and vegetation, Thornhill and his men watched every movement with growing tension. Tracker Price noticed something disturbing. There were fresh marks on the trail's ground, as if something heavy had been dragged along it in the last few days. Ruth's abandoned farmhouse loomed through the mist rising from the valley. It was a dilapidated wooden structure, with dark windows like empty eye sockets and a leaning barn that threatened to collapse at any moment. Ruth led Langston to the front door, inviting him inside to discuss prices more comfortably. The merchant hesitated for a moment, instinctively sensing something wrong with the cold hospitality, but entered, keeping his hand close to the revolver hidden under his coat. The interior of the house was surprisingly clean, in contrast to the state of the property's exterior. There was a wooden table in the center of the main room, chairs arranged with careful geometrical arrangement, and a fireplace where embers still glowed faintly. Ruth lit 2 oil lamps, filling the room with yellowish light that made shadows dance on the bare wooden walls. She asked Langston to sit while she made tea, a common gesture of courtesy in those days, but in the context of that isolated house, it felt like a prelude to something sinister. It was then that the back door opened silently. Silas Brennan entered the room with the stillness of a predator, his dark eyes fixed on Langston with disturbing intensity. He said nothing at first, simply positioning himself between the merchant and the exit door, blocking any easy escape. Ruth continued preparing the tea as if nothing unusual were happening, but there was something overly rehearsed about the scene, like actors playing roles memorized through previous rehearsals. Langston felt danger materialize around him like thick fog. He slowly rose to his feet, mentioning that he needed to check his wagon before the rain began. Silas stepped forward, still silent, and it was this movement that saved the merchant's life. Outside, Sheriff Thornhill and his men had positioned themselves around the house as soon as they noticed Silas's arrival. When they saw the young man's threatening movements through the window, they stormed the property with weapons drawn. The house erupted in confusion. Silas reached for a shotgun propped in the corner of the room, but was tackled by two men before his fingers touched the wood. Ruth dropped the teapot, which shattered on the wooden floor, releasing dark liquid that spread like blood. She didn't scream, didn't try to run. She simply stood in the center of the room, watching the scene with an expression the men present would later describe as profound disappointment, as if a long-awaited game had been prematurely interrupted. Thornhill ordered both men handcuffed, while his men searched the property. What they found that night surpassed even the sheriff's darkest expectations. In the leaning barn, beneath wooden planks carefully arranged to resemble ordinary flooring, was a cellar dug into the earth. The steps led down to a damp darkness that reeked of nausea. When they descended with lit torches, the men discovered a space that appeared to have been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. The basement walls were reinforced with wooden beams, as if someone had planned to use the space indefinitely. Metal hooks were fixed to the low ceiling. Rusty chains hung at varying lengths, and on a rough wooden shelf, tools were arranged in an orderly fashion that suggested familiarity and frequent use. But most disturbing were the personal belongings piled in a corner: boots, hats, coats, bags. Each item was mentally catalogued by men who recognized clothing belonging to neighbors and acquaintances who had disappeared over the past 2 years. Dr. Whitmore, who was overseeing the operation, surveyed the scene with a grave expression. He noticed stains on the compacted earth walls, patterns that his medical experience allowed him to interpret, but which his humanity resisted fully accepting. He ordered everyone to leave the basement immediately, and that the area be sealed until a more thorough investigation could be conducted in daylight. Silas and Ruth were taken to Hazard Jail under heavy armed guard. During the entire ride down the mountain, through the rain that had finally begun to fall, neither of them said a single word. They didn't deny it, didn't protest their innocence, didn't ask for a lawyer. They simply rode in silence, their hands cuffed, staring straight ahead with blank expressions that were more disturbing than any confession could have been. News of the arrest spread through the mountains with surprising speed. Families who had lost loved ones began arriving in Hazard, seeking answers the sheriff could not yet fully provide. The investigation was just beginning, and what would be uncovered in the coming days would shed light on a darkness many wished had remained hidden forever. The next morning dawned with a thick fog covering Hazard like a grey blanket. Sheriff Thornhill hadn't slept. Spending the night organizing documents and preparing for the interrogations he knew would be crucial. In the makeshift cell of the small county office, Silas and Ruth sat in absolute silence, sitting in opposite corners like wax figures, their eyes fixed on inconspicuous spots on the wooden walls. Thornhill decided to start with Silas. The young man was taken to a separate room, his handcuffs secured while 2 armed guards flanked the door. The sheriff sat across the table from the prisoner, studying that thin, expressionless face that seemed carved from cold stone. For nearly an hour, Thornhill asked pointed questions about the disappearances, the objects found in the cave, and the cellar beneath the barn. Silas didn't respond, just breathed slowly and regularly, as if he were alone in the room. The strategy of silence was frustrating but not unexpected. Thornhill had dealt with seasoned criminals before, men who understood that every word could be used against them in court. But there was something different about Silas. It wasn't just a refusal to cooperate, it was a complete absence of emotion. No nervousness, no fear, no anger, just an absolute emptiness that transformed this 20-year-old into something far more disturbing than his age suggested. Ruth's interrogation was equally fruitless. When brought into the room, she sat erect, hands folded in her lap, and fixed her dark eyes on the sheriff with an intensity that made the men present look away. Thornhill tried a different approach with her, speaking in a softer tone, mentioning that cooperation could mean leniency. Ruth tilted her head slightly to the side, like a bird studying a curious insect, but didn't utter a single syllable. While the interrogations failed, the physical investigation progressed. Dr. Whitmore returned to Ruth's farm accompanied by a larger team, including a state government representative who had traveled from Frankfurt upon receiving news of the arrest. What they discovered in the cellar beneath the barn, now examined under proper light and with careful methodology, confirmed their worst fears. The stains on the walls were unmistakably organic, patterns that suggested violent events had occurred repeatedly in that confined space. The tools on the shelf included instruments that might have legitimate farm uses, but contextualized in that environment, they took on sinister meanings. Even more disturbing was a notebook found hidden under a loose floorboard in the corner of the basement, its yellowed pages filled with meticulous handwriting, documenting something that made even hardened men feel sick. The notebook contained dates, names, and descriptions written in cold clinical language. It began in September of 1855 and ended abruptly in April of 1857. Each entry described encounters with travelers on mountain trails, detailed how they had been lured to isolated locations with promises of shelter or trade, and recorded what happened next with disturbing precision that avoided explicit terms but left little to the imagination. The handwriting alternated between two distinct ones. One was angular and cramped, later identified as Silas's through comparison with old Brennan family documents. The other was more rounded and elaborate, clearly belonging to Ruth. The entries appeared to be written alternately, as if the cousins were keeping a collaborative diary of their actions. There were even observations made about each other's work, constructive criticism, and suggestions for improvement written with the emotional detachment of someone discussing carpentry or planting techniques. What made the notebook even more unsettling was its complete absence of justifications or rationalizations. There were no claims of revenge, no attempts to explain motivations, no emotional confessions. It was simply a factual record of events, as a farmer would document crops or a merchant record transactions. This mechanical coldness revealed something about Silas and Ruth that transcended ordinary evil and entered territory that men of that time lacked the vocabulary to describe. Dr. Whitmore, who had studied medicine in Boston before returning to Kentucky, was familiar with emerging theories about abnormal human behavior that were beginning to circulate in academic circles on the East Coast. He suspected he was dealing with something that decades later would be the subject of intense psychiatric study. But in 1857, such concepts were unknown in the rural mountains. To the residents of Hazard and surrounding counties, Silas and Ruth were simply manifestations of pure evil, demons with human faces who had chosen a path of absolute darkness. As evidence mounted, public pressure grew exponentially. Grieving families demanded swift justice, and whispers of lynching began to circulate in taverns and markets. Thornhill doubled his guard around the jail, knowing that revenge mobs were common in those days and often resulted in violence that would taint any subsequent legal proceedings. He wanted Silas and Ruth to face a formal court, for their actions to be judged under the light of the law, not in the darkness of mob justice. The investigation expanded to Silas's cabin, where additional discoveries painted an even darker picture. Beneath the floorboards of the main cabin, a similar excavation revealed another hidden space, smaller than Ruth's but equally disturbing. Here were stored personal objects that clearly held sentimental value to their original owners. Love letters, daguerreotype photographs, lockets with locks of hair, wedding rings. It was as if Silas collected not just belongings, but fragments of the lives he had interrupted. Among the objects, investigators found something particularly touching: the diary of a young woman named Elizabeth Hartley, who had disappeared while traveling to find family in Virginia in the summer of 1856. Her final entries spoke of hope for the future, dreams of marriage and a new life in the eastern cities. The final entry, dated July 12th, mentioned that she had met a friendly young couple in the mountains who offered to help with a lame horse. After that, the pages were blank. Sheriff Thornhill brought the diary to Ruth during a final interrogation attempt. He placed the small leather-bound book on the table between them and watched her face closely, searching for any sign of recognition or remorse. Ruth stared at the diary for a long moment, then raised her eyes to the sheriff and, for the first time since her arrest, spoke. Her voice was calm and measured, without tremor or hesitation. She said simply, "The mountains are hungry. We were simply feeding what was here long before we were born." Then she lapsed into silence, refusing to elaborate or answer any further questions. Those enigmatic words would be the only ones Ruth Calloway would utter during the entire legal proceedings that followed. Ruth's words echoed in Sheriff Thornhill's mind for days. There was an almost ritualistic quality to them, as if she genuinely believed she was fulfilling some purpose beyond ordinary human comprehension. He decided to investigate the Brennan and Calloway families, seeking to understand if there was any backstory that could illuminate the path that led two 20-year-olds to commit such dark acts. What he discovered was disturbing in a different way. Both Silas's and Ruth's families were ancient Appalachian mountain lineages, established in the region since the early 19th century. They were ordinary families of settlers, farmers, and hunters who lived hard but honest lives. There were no records of unusual violence, serious crimes, or aberrant behavior in previous generations. Both their parents were known as hard-working and respectable people in the isolated communities where they lived. What they did have, however, was profound isolation. The Brennan and Calloway properties were located in the most remote regions of Perry County, where contact with other humans was rare and social interactions limited. Silas had grown up virtually alone after his father's disappearance, a strange child according to reports from neighbors who occasionally saw him, always quiet and observant. Ruth, after her parents' deaths, spent years in near-total solitude, her only regular companion being Silas, who began visiting her regularly when they both approached 18. An elderly Methodist pastor named Reverend Thomas Gilpin provided crucial information. He had attempted to minister to isolated mountain communities during the 1840s, including visits to the Brennan and Calloway families. Gilpin remembered Silas as a boy of perhaps 12, already demonstrating a disturbing fascination with death. The boy collected animal bones, arranged them in geometric patterns on the cabin floor, and spoke of death as if it were a preferable state to life. Silas's mother seemed embarrassed by these peculiarities, but unable or unwilling to correct them. As for Ruth, the Reverend remembered her as a silent teenager who refused to participate in prayers or hymns. She would sit in the corner during his sermons, watching him with eyes he described as empty of divine light, like windows into a place where God never penetrated. Gilpin admitted that after a few visits he began to avoid the two families' properties, sensing something indefinable but deeply disturbing in those isolated homes. While Thornhill gathered this information, the Hazard community prepared for what promised to be the most dramatic trial in the county's history. The district attorney, a high-energy lawyer named Samuel Brigham, traveled from Frankfurt specifically to lead the prosecution. Brigham had a statewide reputation as an eloquent orator and a relentless criminal case builder. He pored over every document, examined every piece of evidence, and prepared an argument intended to be unassailable. Silas and Ruth's defense was taken over by a local attorney named Marcus Thorne, a 50-year-old man who took the case not out of sympathy for the accused, but out of a deep belief in due process. Thorne knew there was no real defense to what the evidence suggested, but he was determined to ensure the court followed proper procedures. He visited his clients in jail multiple times, trying to establish basic communication, but found only stubborn silence from Silas and occasional monosyllabic responses from Ruth. The trial was scheduled for early July 1857, allowing time for witnesses from distant counties to travel to Hazard. The county courthouse, a modest wooden building with a capacity of perhaps 70 people, would clearly be insufficient for the expected crowd. The decision was made to hold the trial outdoors, under a large tent erected in the town's main square, something unusual but not unprecedented at the time. In the days leading up to the trial, Hazard became a regional center of attention. Journalists from Lexington and Louisville arrived to cover the case, staying in the few available guest houses or camping nearby. Curious onlookers traveled from neighboring counties, some driven by a desire for justice, others by a morbid fascination with the nature of the crimes. The small town's population temporarily tripled, straining resources and heightening the already palpable tension in the mountain air. On the morning of July 4th, a date symbolically chosen by Prosecutor Brigham as a reminder of American justice and freedom, the trial began. The tent was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds of people standing on the sides or crowding outside, trying to hear the proceedings through the canvas walls. The presiding judge was Hamilton Crawford, a respected 62-year-old judge known for wise decisions and a controlled temper, even in the most emotional circumstances. Silas and Ruth were brought in under heavy guard, their chains clanking rhythmically as they walked down the center aisle between rows of silent spectators. For the first time since their arrest, they were dressed in clean, county-issued clothing, Silas in a simple suit that hung loosely on his thin frame, Ruth in a dark dress that covered her wrists and neck completely. Both maintained blank expressions, staring straight ahead as if the hostile crowd around them were non-existent. Prosecutor Brigham opened with a powerful speech that silenced even the most distant murmurs. He spoke of the sanctity of human life, of the trust travelers placed in the hospitality of mountain dwellers, and of the monstrous betrayal of that trust by two individuals who had turned isolated trails into death traps. His voice echoed through the tent, perfectly modulated to convey moral outrage without descending into hysteria. Brigham then began methodically presenting his evidence. He first called in businessman Herbert Langston, who described his experience at Ruth's farm, with details that drew audible reactions from the audience. Langston spoke of the sense of danger he felt, of Silas's menacing movements, of the unnatural coldness in the atmosphere of that abandoned house. His credibility was unquestionable. He was a respectable man with no motivation to lie. Testimonies from grieving families followed, each identifying belongings of missing loved ones, among objects recovered from the cave and cellars. An elderly woman named Martha Dougherty held the silver pocket watch that had belonged to her son, Michael, tears streaming down her wrinkled face as she confirmed the engraved initials. A farmer named William Hartley identified his sister Elizabeth's diary, his voice breaking as he read aloud the final entry about meeting a friendly young couple. Dopsax. Whitmore was a crucial witness, describing in medical but understandable terms what the physical evidence suggested about events in the hidden cellars. He avoided graphic language out of respect for the audience's sensibilities, but his implications were clear enough to provoke reactions of horror and nausea among spectators. Several people had to leave the tent, unable to bear the weight of what was being revealed. The most shocking moment of the trial came when Prosecutor Brigham presented the notebook found in Ruth's basement. He didn't read the entire entries, knowing that explicit details would be inappropriate for public hearing and potentially damaging to the case. Instead, he read selected excerpts that demonstrated premeditation, organization, and a complete lack of remorse. Each date, read aloud, corresponded to a documented disappearance of a traveler, connecting an inescapable temporal pattern. The alternating handwriting between Silas and Ruth revealed a deeply disturbing intimate collaboration. They were not simply circumstantial accomplices, but deliberate partners who planned, executed, and documented the acts together. Brigham argued that this demonstrated a level of coordination and mutual complicity that made both equally culpable for each individual act. There was no case for coercion or reluctant participation when the defendant's own handwriting told the story of voluntary involvement. Tracker Jonathan Price testified about the cave's discovery, guiding the jury through a topographical description that established its strategic location between the two properties. He brought hand-drawn maps showing trails, distances, and landmarks that demonstrated the intimate knowledge of the terrain necessary to transport objects between locations undetected. Price explained how someone would need to know every rock and tree in those mountains to move confidently in absolute darkness, knowledge that only years of experience could provide. Sheriff Thornhill provided detailed testimony about the entire investigation, from initial disappearances to the final arrest. He presented meticulous lists of missing persons, dates, known circumstances, and recovered items. His credibility as a respected law enforcement officer and his unembellished presentation of facts gave additional weight to the charges. When he finished, the jury had before them a complete picture of a campaign of violence that lasted at least 2 years and claimed the lives of at least 12 people. Marcus Thorne's defense was nearly impossible under the circumstances. He couldn't deny physical evidence. He couldn't question the credibility of witnesses. He couldn't offer an alibi when the defendant's own writings incriminated them. His strategy was to try to argue that Silas and Ruth were mentally incapable of understanding the nature of their actions, that they were living in a state of shared delirium induced by extreme isolation in the mountains. Thorne called Reverend Gilpin to testify about Silas's strange behavior as a child, attempting to establish a pattern of abnormal mental development. He called neighbors who described the profound isolation of both families, suggesting that a lack of adequate social interaction had resulted in a distorted understanding of morality and humanity. He argued that the mountains themselves, with their crushing solitude and constant dangers, could warp young, vulnerable minds in ways that people living in normal communities would hardly understand. But Prosecutor Brigham systematically dismantled these arguments during cross-examination. He demonstrated that Silas and Ruth were perfectly capable of functioning in society when necessary, that they conducted business transactions normally, and that they understood concepts of right and wrong well enough to conceal their actions. The notebook itself demonstrated a capacity for rational planning, methodical organization, and an awareness that what they did needed to be hidden from authorities. This was inconsistent with legal insanity as defined by Kentucky law at the time. Throughout the trial, Silas and Ruth remained impassive. They didn't react to the grieving family's emotional testimonies, showed no discomfort when evidence was presented, consulted their lawyer, or took notes. They simply sat side by side, staring straight ahead with the same blank expression that had disturbed everyone from the beginning. Some spectators commented that the two seemed to be watching someone else's trial, completely disconnected from the reality that their own lives were being decided. Thorne attempted a last, desperate tactic by requesting permission for the defendants to testify in their own defense. It was risky, knowing that anything they said would likely further harm them, but it was also the only possible way to humanize them in the eyes of the jury. Judge Crawford granted permission, warning that the defendants had a constitutional right to remain silent if they so chose. Silas was called first. He rose slowly, walked to the witness chair, its chains dragging on the wooden floor, and sat down with an oddly relaxed posture. Thorne asked carefully formulated questions about his childhood, his loneliness, his relationship with Ruth. Silas responded in monosyllables when he did, his voice so low that the judge had to repeatedly ask him to speak louder. He offered no explanations, expressed no remorse, and made no attempt to justify anything. When Brigham took over cross-examination, he changed tactics. He asked Silas directly if he had killed Reverend Samuel Mackey. A long silence followed. Brigham repeated the question, his voice echoing throughout the tent. Silas finally looked up and directly at the prosecutor. After a moment that seemed to last forever, he answered with a single word, "Yes." The tent erupted in audible reactions. Judge Crawford banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. Grieving families wept openly. Some men shouted demands for immediate justice. Brigham continued methodically, asking about each named victim. To each question, Silas responded with the same calm monosyllable, "Yes." There was no defiance in his voice, no pride or shame. It was simply factual confirmation, as if he were acknowledging he had performed ordinary household chores. When it was Ruth's turn to testify, she initially refused to stand. Guards had to practically carry her to the witness stand. Once seated, she stared at Prosecutor Brigham with the same disturbing intensity she had directed at Sheriff Thornhill weeks earlier. Thorne asked her questions similar to those he had asked Silas, but Ruth didn't answer any of them. She remained completely silent, like a statue of dark stone. Brigham attempted cross-examination, but quickly realized he was wasting time. Ruth had clearly decided she wouldn't speak anymore, maintaining that stubborn silence that was almost more disturbing than Silas's monosyllabic confessions. After 10 minutes of unanswered questions, Judge Crawford dismissed the witness, allowing Ruth to return to her seat beside her cousin. Closing arguments were presented the next day. Brigham built an emotional but legally sound case for a full conviction. He argued that society had an obligation to protect itself from predators who viewed other humans as mere prey, that the Kentucky mountains could not become lawless territory where travelers disappeared without consequences for perpetrators. His voice trembled with genuine indignation when he spoke of the victims, ordinary people who trusted traditional mountain hospitality only to encounter monsters dressed in human faces. Marcus Thorne delivered his closing argument, knowing it was a near-futile exercise, but determined to fulfill his duty to the end. He appealed to the jury's compassion, asking them to consider the brutal environment in which Silas and Ruth had grown up, the isolation that warped their souls from an early age. He argued that they were products of extraordinary circumstances, victims as much as perpetrators of the crushing solitude of the mountains. He urged the jury to recognize that executing two 20-year-olds, however heinous their acts, would not bring back the dead or heal the wounds of the grieving families. But Thorne could see in the faces of the 12 jurors that his words were falling on infertile ground. They had seen too much evidence, heard too much testimony, felt too much weight of the crimes to be moved by abstract appeals to environment and upbringing. When Judge Crawford instructed the jury on the applicable law and dismissed them for deliberation, Few in the audience had any doubts about what the verdict would be. The jury returned in less than 2 hours. The surprisingly short deliberation time for such a complex case spoke volumes about the unanimity of its conclusion. The jury foreman, a burly farmer named Josiah Wright, rose when asked and read the verdict in a firm but emotionally restrained voice. Both Silas Brennan and Ruth Calloway were found guilty on all counts, with no mercy recommended. The crowd under the tent and gathered outside reacted with boisterous approval. People hugged, wept with relief, and shouted thanks for justice. Judge Crawford allowed a brief moment of emotional catharsis before restoring order with firm blows of his gavel. He then turned to the condemned men, his expression grave but not vengeful, and handed down the sentence as required by Kentucky law for multiple premeditated murders. Silas Brennan and Ruth Calloway were to be hanged by the neck until dead in Hazard Square. An execution scheduled for August 23, 1857, exactly 7 weeks after the verdict. The judge pronounced the sentence with appropriate solemnity, recognizing the gravity of ordering the death of 2 human beings, even those guilty of such gruesome crimes. He concluded by noting that justice was being served not out of revenge, but out of the need for civilized society to protect its members from predators who violated the most fundamental social contract. Silas and Ruth were taken back to jail under even heavier guard, authorities fearing lynching attempts now that the official conviction had been pronounced. But curiously, the crowd that moments earlier had been shouting approval of the verdict calmly dispersed. There was satisfaction that the legal system had worked, that the guilty would be punished through appropriate means, not through mob violence. It was a testament to that community's deep belief in due process, even when facing crimes that defied human comprehension. In the following weeks, as the execution date approached, Hazard experienced an eerie atmosphere. The immediate tension had passed, replaced by a heavy melancholy. Journalists who remained in the city sent dispatches to publications in Lexington, Louisville, and even Cincinnati, making the case nationally known. Articles appeared describing the crimes in carefully chosen terms to avoid more disturbing details, yet still capturing the essential horror of what had happened in those isolated mountains. Visitors continued to arrive, some driven by morbid curiosity to see condemned criminals before their execution, others by genuine interest in understanding how something so dark could emerge from the seemingly tranquil Kentucky mountains. The jail where Silas and Ruth waited became a destination for macabre pilgrimages, with people crowding outside hoping to glimpse the faces of the condemned through the small barred windows. Sheriff Thornhill allowed limited and supervised visits, primarily from clergy who sought to offer spiritual comfort to the condemned. Several ministers from different denominations attempted to reach the souls of Silas and Ruth during those final weeks, seeking full confessions or signs of repentance that might bring some closure to the victims' families. Their attempts were uniformly unsuccessful. A young Baptist pastor named Reverend Daniel Morrison spent hours sitting in Silas's cell, reading biblical passages about redemption and forgiveness. Silas listened silently, but when asked if he wanted to confess his sins and seek salvation, he simply looked away. Morrison later described the experience as like talking to a shadow, something that seemed human on the surface, but lacked some essential spark that defines humanity. Ruth was equally impervious to spiritual ministry. An elderly Catholic nun named Sister Catherine, known for her ability to reach even the most hardened criminals, visited Ruth multiple times. She brought wildflowers from the mountains, thinking that touches of natural beauty might stir some emotion in the young convict. Ruth accepted the flowers mechanically, held them briefly, and then dropped them onto the dirt floor of the cell. Sister Catherine left after her last visit with tears in her eyes, declaring that she had encountered something beyond her comprehension or ability to help. Meanwhile, the investigation into the victim's fate continued. Search teams scoured extensive areas around Silas and Ruth's properties, searching for additional evidence or human remains. The mountains, however, held their secrets tenaciously. Natural caves pierced the Appalachian limestone like Swiss cheese, deep canyons hid beneath layers of dense vegetation, and the earth itself seemed to absorb and conceal whatever was buried within. Some discoveries were made. In a steep ravine about 2 kilometers from Ruth's farm, searchers found fragments of human bones partially exposed by erosion. A medical expert from Frankfurt confirmed that they were the remains of at least 3 different individuals, but specific identification was impossible with limited forensic knowledge at the time. The bones were buried in Hazard Cemetery under a simple headstone, marking them as unknown victims of the Brennan and Callaway crimes. Dr. Whitmore theorized in an official report that Silas and Ruth likely employed an elaborate disposal system that took advantage of the mountain's natural geography. Deep ravines, unexplored caves, and swampy areas where soft earth would permanently swallow evidence. Without full confessions from the perpetrators, the exact location of each victim would remain a mystery. This uncertainty tormented families who had no bodies to bury, denying them the closure that proper funerals would provide. As August 23rd approached, carpenters constructed a gallows in Hazard's central square. It was a simple but functional structure designed to accommodate two simultaneous hangings. The construction of the gallows itself became a public event, with residents stopping to observe the progress and discuss the upcoming procedures. There was debate over proper protocol, as double hangings were rare in Kentucky, and no one wanted mistakes that could cause prolonged suffering, even for such despicable convicts. The night before the execution, a violent storm swept through the Appalachian mountains. Lightning lit the dark sky with unsettling frequency, thunder echoed between the peaks like distant artillery, and rain fell in thick sheets that turned Hazard streets into muddy rivers. Some residents interpreted the storm as a divine sign, a manifestation of heavenly wrath against crimes committed in those mountains. Others saw it as mere meteorological coincidence, though they admitted the timing seemed appropriately dramatic. In jail, Silas and Ruth remained in separate but adjacent cells, able to hear each other through the thin wooden walls. Throughout their imprisonment, they had exchanged few words even when the opportunity arose. But on that final night, guards reported hearing low murmurs passing between the cells. They could not distinguish specific words, only a constant tone of whispered conversation that continued for hours. When it finally fell silent shortly before dawn, guards peeking through the small cell windows saw both convicts sleeping peacefully, as if nothing extraordinary awaited them in the coming hours. The morning of August 23rd dawned clear and clean, an overnight storm having washed the air and left the sky a rare deep blue even for that time of year. Hazard's population had once again swelled with visitors from neighboring counties and even nearby states. Public executions were community events in that era, seen as necessary displays of justice and warnings against criminal behavior. Entire families attended, though there was debate about the propriety of bringing young people to witness death, even the death of convicted criminals. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Sheriff Thornhill and two deputies went to collect the condemned men from their cells. Silas wore the same simple suit from the trial, now washed and pressed. Ruth wore a gray dress provided by a group of churchwomen who felt a Christian obligation to ensure that even a convicted criminal faced death with basic dignity. Both had refused the elaborate final meal permitted by law, accepting only water and plain bread. The walk from the jail to the gallows in the square was short, perhaps 200 meters, but it passed in profound silence. The crowds gathering on the sides of the street didn't shout insults or words of condemnation. There was somber respect for the moment, a recognition that regardless of how deserved the punishment, witnessing the execution of two 20-year-olds was a solemn event that demanded decorum. Some women wept silently, not out of sympathy for the condemned men, but because of the human tragedy that the whole situation represented. Awaiting on the scaffold was a professional executioner brought from Louisville, an experienced man named only Coleman, who had conducted dozens of hangings throughout Kentucky. He had carefully checked ropes, tested trapdoors, and calculated drop lengths based on the condemned's weight to ensure a quick death by neck-breaking rather than slow strangulation. These were macabre but necessary technical details, reflecting a growing movement even in 1857 to make executions more humane. Judge Crawford was present, as were Prosecutor Brigham and Defense Attorney Thorne. Protocol required that officers involved in the trial witness the execution of the sentence they had helped impose. Also present were family members of the victims, some looking forward with grim expressions of satisfaction at seeing justice finally served, others with faces etched with grief that execution could not cure. Silas and Ruth were positioned side by side on trapdoors, their feet inches apart, as they had been during their trial. Sheriff Thornhill asked if they had any last words, a right granted even to the most despicable criminals. For a long moment, It seemed they would both remain silent until the end. Then Silas turned his head slightly toward Ruth, and she mirrored him. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, some silent communication no one else could interpret. Ruth spoke first, her voice surprisingly clear and audible even to onlookers at the edges of the crowd. "The mountains will remember," she said simply. Then Silas added, as if completing a shared thought, "and they will not forgive easily." There was no obvious threat in the words, no regret, no explanation. They were enigmatic statements that left the audience murmuring, confused about their intended meaning. Coleman, the executioner, didn't allow the moment to linger. With efficiency born of experience, he placed black hoods over the heads of the condemned, then adjusted nooses around their necks. His hands worked quickly but not hurriedly, ensuring everything was positioned correctly. A local clergyman, Reverend Philip Hayes, recited a prayer for the commendation of souls, his voice trembling slightly as he asked for divine mercy for those about to face final judgment. The moment of execution arrived with terrible inevitability. Coleman motioned to his assistant, who pulled a lever that released trapdoors simultaneously. The sound of falling bodies was followed by absolute silence from the crowd. Death was instantaneous for both, necks breaking cleanly and quickly, as Coleman had calculated. The bodies hung motionless, swaying slightly in the morning breeze that was beginning to rise from the valley. Protocol required bodies to remain hanging for 30 minutes to ensure complete death. During this time, the crowd gradually dispersed, many feeling they had witnessed enough. Some remained, compelled by some need to see the process through to its absolute conclusion. Families of the victims stayed longer than most, staring at the suspended bodies as if the physical presence of those remains could somehow validate their losses. When the bodies were finally lowered, Dr. Whitmore examined them and officially declared them dead. The immediate question arose about the disposition of the remains. No family came forward to claim the bodies of Silas or Ruth, distant relatives evidently too ashamed of the infamy to publicly associate with the condemned. After brief consultation, the decision was made to bury them in an unconsecrated corner of Hazard Cemetery, an area reserved for criminals and the homeless. The burial took place at dusk that same day, a quick and unassuming ceremony. Only Sheriff Thornhill, 2 gravediggers, and curiously Marcus Thorne were present. The defense attorney felt obligated to see the case through to its conclusion, though he admitted not fully understanding his own motivation. Simple pine coffins were lowered into shallow graves, and the earth was returned without a farewell address or religious blessing. There were no markers, no headstones. It was as if Hazard wanted to erase Silas and Ruth's physical existence as completely as possible. But memory is not so easily buried. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of what had happened in the Appalachian Mountains continued to spread. Newspapers in distant cities published sensationalized accounts, some heightening already disturbing details with dramatic fabrications. Ballads were composed about crimes, somber songs that travelers sang in taverns across Kentucky. Hazard's name temporarily became synonymous with a place that had barely concealed itself beneath the veneer of mountain hospitality. The weeks after the executions brought subtle but noticeable changes to the communities of the Appalachian Mountains. Travelers who had once happily passed along the secluded trails now did so with renewed caution, eyeing each distant cabin with a distrust that had never existed before. Traditional mountain hospitality, that sacred custom of offering shelter to the lost stranger, took on a hesitancy that tainted once natural interactions. It was as if Silas and Ruth had poisoned something fundamental in the region's culture. Sheriff Thornhill ordered their properties burned. There were no heirs to claim them, and leaving them standing seemed like an invitation to a morbid curiosity the county didn't want to feed. In the first week of September, groups of men climbed mountains with torches and lamp oil. Silas's cabin burned quickly, dry wood catching fire easily, illuminating the night sky for miles. Ruth's farm held out longer, but eventually succumbed to the flames, the barn collapsing in on itself in a spectacle of sparks and ash that danced in the air like restless spirits. The hidden cellars were filled with earth and stone before the burnings, sealed as if they were tombs. Jonathan Price personally supervised the work, ensuring that these spaces that had witnessed so much suffering were obliterated from the physical landscape of the mountains. But he knew, as everyone knew, that memory would linger long after physical evidence disappeared. The cave where belongings belonging to the missing had been stored was also dealt with definitively. After everything had been catalogued and returned to the families when possible, the entrance was dynamited, causing the rock to collapse and completely sealing the cavity. The sound of the explosion echoed through the valleys like delayed thunder, a final punctuation in a story the community desperately wanted closure for. But the mountains don't forget easily. In the months that followed, strange tales began to circulate among residents of remote areas. Hunters spoke of inexplicable sensations as they passed by the sites where properties had stood, feelings of unseen observation that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Lumberjacks avoided certain trails, even when offered more direct routes, unable to rationally explain their reluctance, but following instincts that mountains had taught their ancestors to respect. One particularly persistent story involved a farmer named Elijah Morrison, who acquired land adjacent to Ruth's former property in the spring of 1858. Morrison was a practical man, not inclined to superstition, but after a few months on his new farm, he began experiencing disturbances that tested his skepticism. Unexplained sounds in the wee hours of the morning, the movement of objects he was certain he had left in specific places, a persistent sensation of an unseen presence watching from the shadows of the trees. Morrison never claimed to believe in ghosts or supernatural manifestations, but he abandoned the property after less than a year, refusing to discuss specific reasons. The land remained unowned for decades, eventually being reabsorbed by the forest as if nature itself wanted to erase the traces of human presence. Even today, more than a century later, that particular area of the mountains remains sparsely populated, avoided for reasons locals struggle to articulate clearly. Deeply affected by his role in the investigation, Dr. Whitmore began corresponding with physicians and scholars in eastern cities about the nature of abnormal human behavior. He was convinced that Silas and Ruth represented something future science would need to better understand, some fundamental flaw in human development that produced individuals incapable of empathy or normal moral connection. His letters, preserved in a Louisville medical archive, reveal his mind struggling to categorize what he had witnessed within the emerging scientific frameworks of the time. The victims' families tried to rebuild their lives amid losses that could never be completely overcome. Martha Dougherty, Michael's mother, lived another 17 years after her execution, but never regained the joy that had characterized her personality before her son's disappearance. Neighbors remembered her as a broken woman, a shadow of her former self, spending hours sitting on her porch, gazing at the mountains that had taken her only descendant. William Hartley, Elizabeth's brother, eventually moved to Ohio, unable to continue living in proximity to the mountains that held his sister's final fate. Before leaving, he visited one last time the unconsecrated corner of the cemetery where Silas and Ruth lay in unmarked graves. Witnesses say he remained there for a long hour, not in prayer, but in silent contemplation, perhaps trying to understand how human lives could diverge so completely from the paths of decency and compassion. Reverend Morrison, a young Baptist pastor who had tried to reach Silas's soul, eventually left ministry altogether. In a farewell letter to his congregation, he confessed that his encounter with Silas had shaken the foundations of his faith, causing him to question basic understandings of human nature and the possibility of universal redemption. It wasn't that he had stopped believing in God, he explained, but that he could no longer preach with certainty on subjects he now saw as infinitely more complex than simple theology allowed. Sheriff Thornhill remained in office for another 13 years before retiring. He never spoke publicly about the Brennan-Calloway case after his execution, but he kept a detailed personal file that he eventually donated to the County Historical Society. These documents, available to researchers today, reveal a man who understood he was facing something beyond common criminality, something that defied the comfortable categories in which society preferred to think of good and evil. Marcus Thorne, a defense attorney who took on an impossible case, gained renewed respect in the Kentucky legal community for his willingness to defend even the most despicable clients. He continued practicing law in Hazard for decades, but colleagues noticed something had changed in him after the trial. He had become quieter, more reflective, less inclined to absolute certainty about anything. Perhaps his closeness with Silas and Ruth had taught him humility about the limits of human understanding. In the years that followed, historians and journalists occasionally visited Hazard to research a case that had briefly captured national attention. They found the community reluctant to revisit the past. Residents who answered questions politely but without elaboration, clearly preferring to leave history buried along with its perpetrators. It was as if the region had collectively decided that some memories were better forgotten than perpetually examined. But stories have a life of their own, independent of the desires of those who lived them. Accounts of Silas and Ruth appeared in American crime compendiums, in books on the dark history of the Appalachian Mountains, in whispers exchanged around campfires. Details became distorted over time, inventions were added, real facts mixed with speculation, until separating truth from fiction became nearly impossible. What remains undeniable, even through the mists of time and the distortion of retellings, is the fundamental essence of what happened in those mountains during 2 dark years in the mid-19th century. 2 young men, born into extreme isolation, developed a partnership that transformed trails of hospitality into paths of terror. The full reasons for their actions died with them that August morning in 1857, carrying to unmarked graves secrets that no investigation could fully extract. Decades later, as a new generation grew up with no direct memory of the events, attitudes began to subtly shift. Areas where estates had once stood became objects of curiosity rather than fear, places where urban adventurers occasionally ventured seeking connection with a macabre past. They found only forest reclaiming territory, stone foundations covered in moss and vines, a deep silence broken only by the natural sounds of wildlife and wind through the pines. A particularly interesting development occurred in the 1920s, when an anthropology student at the University of Kentucky conducted research on oral traditions from the Appalachian Mountains. Among the stories collected was a version of Silas and Ruth, passed down through generations but transformed into something almost mythical. In this version, they were depicted less as criminals and more as manifestations of the spirit of the mountains themselves, embodiments of the eternal hunger that isolated peaks felt for human companionship. It was a romantic interpretation that older residents, those who still remembered or had heard from parents who remembered, rejected with indignation. For them, there was nothing mythical or poetic about what had happened. These were real crimes committed against real people, families destroyed, lives cut short prematurely by the deliberate choices of 2 individuals who had the capacity to choose differently but chose a path of darkness. The Perry County Historical Archives has meticulously preserved original case documents. These include trial records, transcribed testimony, evidence lists, and even period drawings showing the layout of the properties. These documents occasionally attract academic researchers interested in American criminal history or the development of the judicial system in frontier regions. Each visitor leaves with the impression of having touched something deeply disturbing, a window into human capabilities they would rather not acknowledge. In 1975, an investigative journalist attempted to locate Silas and Ruth's graves in Hazard Cemetery, planning an article on forgotten criminals in American history. He discovered that records of their exact location had been lost or deliberately discarded decades earlier. An unconsecrated section of the cemetery had been expanded multiple times, with new burials obscuring older ones. It was impossible to determine which soil covered the cousins' remains, and cemetery management showed little interest in facilitating the search. Perhaps it's fitting that Silas and Ruth's final physical location remains uncertain. They spent their lives in the shadows of the mountains, hiding their true natures behind ordinary faces, concealing their actions in cellars and caves beyond the reach of daylight. That they return to obscurity and death seems poetic justice, albeit inadvertent. The Appalachian Mountains continue to loom large against the eastern Kentucky horizon, their slopes covered in forests that have seen generations of humankind come and go. Trails that Silas and Ruth walked in the darkness still exist, though many have been paved or abandoned, as the modern world brought new transportation routes. The isolated communities that characterized the region in 1857 have been connected by roads, electricity, and telecommunications, making the extreme isolation of that era almost unimaginable to contemporary residents. But something lingers in those mountains, a sensation that sensitive visitors sometimes report. It's not necessarily supernatural, perhaps simply a recognition that places hold echoes of significant events that occurred there. The mountains have witnessed birth and death, love and hate, kindness and cruelty throughout centuries of human occupation. The story of Silas and Ruth is just one among thousands, but its particularly dark nature has left an impression that time has not completely erased. For families who lost loved ones in those 2 terrible years, closure never came completely. Many never recovered bodies to bury, never knew exactly what happened in their loved ones' final moments. They lived with an absence that no public execution or legal process could fill. Their descendants carry a legacy of unresolved loss, family stories with missing chapters that no amount of research can recover. The case remains a disturbing reminder of human capacities we prefer not to acknowledge. Silas and Ruth were not monsters in the supernatural sense. They were human beings who, through a combination of isolation, circumstance, and personal choices, became predators of their own kind. There was no simple explanation for who they were or why they did what they did. Modern psychology could offer theories about sociopathy, the effects of trauma, or extreme social deprivation, but even with all contemporary knowledge, individuals like them continue to defy complete understanding. We look back over nearly 2 centuries trying to understand, trying to find lessons or meanings that make horror more palatable. Perhaps the lesson is simply that genuine evil exists, that not all human behavior can be satisfactorily explained, that dark mysteries remain even after all testimony has been heard and all evidence examined. The mountains hold their secrets, and some of those secrets may be destined to remain partially veiled. Today, if you visit, hazard, or hike the Appalachian mountain trails of eastern Kentucky, you likely won't find any mention of Silas Brennan and Ruth Calloway. There are no historical markers marking where properties once stood, no monuments to the victims, no public acknowledgement that something significant and terrible happened there. The region prefers to be known for its natural beauty, rich cultural traditions, and the resilience of its communities through economic hardship and social change. And perhaps that's as it should be. Not every story needs to be perpetually commemorated or remembered. Some can be left to sleep in the pages of dusty archives, occasionally emerging when a curious researcher stumbles upon them, but never dominating the identity of place or people. Mountains are bigger than any individual story, and life continues through generations that don't bear the direct weight of past tragedies. But for those who choose to look, for those who investigate preserved documents and reconstruct events from those dark years, the story of Silas and Ruth offers a disturbing window into what human beings are capable of when the darkest elements of human nature encounter circumstances that allow their full expression. It is a story without comfortable redemption, without a final transformation of the villains into something understandable or sympathetic. It is simply a tale of darkness encountered, confronted, and ultimately ended through imperfect processes of human justice. The mountains remember, as Ruth said in her final words, perhaps not in a supernatural or mystical way, but in the way places carry the weight of history, as the earth absorbs the memories of those who walked upon it. And we remember too, not to glorify or sensationalize, but to acknowledge the disturbing complexity of the human experience in all its manifestations, even the darkest. If this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories exploring dark and forgotten mysteries of the past. Leave a like if you enjoyed this in-depth investigation, and share in the comments where you're watching from, and if you know of other dark stories worth telling. Until next time, explore the shadows of history.